to come onto the stage. It's racetrack management and safety. So you're going to hear about technical aspects of racetrack management, but also, most importantly, probably, is how racetracks can improve the safety for the main performers. I suppose that really is about the horses and the jockeys, but they're also spectators, so sometimes put in danger at certain sporting venues. We have three speakers with us. We have John Ridley, Dr. Makoto Inoue, and Graeme Logan. And you met Dr. Inoue yesterday, and he was very kind about his fellow colleagues, saying how much they enjoyed alcohol as well and how much they enjoyed a drink. But we're very lucky to have the Vice Chairman of the Asian Racing Federation with us for this panel. But we'll start with John Ridley. John is Director of Racing Capital Projects at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. John, you're going to talk about racetrack design, striving for safety and consistency.
Thank you very much indeed. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here today and allowing me the opportunity to talk on the subject of racetrack design, striving for safety and consistency. I appreciate that I'm speaking to mostly an audience of leaders, and I'm hoping to give you a 360-degree perspective of what I think is an extremely important subject. Firstly, I'd like to remind everybody that an excellent performing racing surface translates directly to your bottom line. There's been a lot of talk at the conference so far about the brand and about income, etc. Please remember that a lot of hard work goes into your racing surface and does improve your brand and does improve your bottom line. As an example, I'd like to set the scene, a race meeting we had back in 2016 at Happy Valley, Wednesday the 19th of October. As usual, we walked the track early of a morning, and when we walked the track in the rain gauge from the last 24 hours, there was 159 millimetres of rain sitting in the gauge. We all know that our bosses get a little bit nervous when there's 159 millimetres of rain in the last 24 hours. So I rang the Executive Director of Racing and told him not to worry. I wouldn't be walking the track again unless we got another 100 millimetres of rain during the day. I'm very superstitious, so I should never have said that. Between 3 and 5 p.m. we had a major storm, and we got a further 173 millimetres of rain. We downgraded the track at 5 o'clock to soft. We ran the first race of the meeting at 7:30. That particular race was run on a track that was rated yielding. After 2 races, we went to good to yielding, and after race 7, we went up to good, and we actually ran that race 7 quicker than standard time. It's not that I'm trying to say how good we are, because my point on this story is that, quite frankly, the amount of money that we spend on construction and on design is basically exactly the same that you're spending on your tracks in your country. It's not about the amount of money that you spend sometimes, it's the way you go about it. And this is what I'd like to do with my presentation today, to try to explain what I think is the way to go forward on tracks construction. The first piece of information on track design that really included a scientific approach was undertaken in Sweden in a study on standardbred racing. And we've heard today and yesterday quite a few times about the amount of work that's being done in standardbreds. There was a very interesting paper published in the Equine Veterinary Journal in April 1975. And in summarising their findings, there was one very particular quote that I found extremely interesting. And the quote was, "There are so far no international standards for track design and construction." What I'd like to do today is take a look at where is racetrack design and construction and operations at in 2018. As at today, there is still very little information published, and only over the last few years there has been limited research into the relationship between equine, the horse, and tracks. Unfortunately, basically none of this research that's been collected to date can actually be adopted in the design of a racetrack. The design of racing and training tracks is still very much up to the racing expert. And I'll put myself in that field, we'll get shot down later no doubt, and we have all our own views. Firstly, the expert is strongly influenced by the size of the venue, the location, the climate, the availability of resources, including financial, stakeholders' expectations, and lastly the usage of the track, including also we need to consider the operator's maintenance knowledge and the operator's skill base. We have to think about all these things long before we start even thinking about the horse. In reality, the racing expert does not really consider the equine until he starts considering the risk factors that he needs to address in his design. Those risk factors are summarised on the slide that's up on the screen at the moment, and we look at things like track surface properties, we look at vertical hardness, horizontal shear strength, the rebound timing, the difference between training and racing surfaces, and the banking and the layout of the track. They're all the things that we start to consider in relation to the horse. Also in the slide up there, I've put a graph that I took out of the white paper, which is a publication that was done in America, which is a very, very good paper. I'll come back to that one later. And we also have to consider in the surface what we call the first impact, second impact, the support that the horse looks for, and the rollover where he takes back off. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information for track people coming from the veterinary world on how all this works, but this particular paper is actually very good. The next thing we look at, of course, there are many associated risk factors that affect the welfare of horses that are totally outside of the risk that we can reduce by well-designed and maintained track. This is very much where excellent proactive veterinary and trainers' involvement makes a large difference, a huge difference in many of the areas. Injuries are not always the track's fault, though I quite often get blamed for them, but I am not here today to discuss this slide. It's not my expertise. But what I'm politely saying here is that people who design and build tracks rely very heavily on the racing club, its expertise and other areas to help them produce a safe and consistent track. The track expert, to reduce equine risks associated with his design, generally follow the following design principles. And they are quite frankly, the way I look at them, the length of the track, bigger, generally better. In other words, a straight track or a track with a 200-metre radius bend will be far better than one with 100. No short, narrow turns, curves, bends. In other words, keep them nice and large, keep them flowing. Make sure you've got adequate banking on your turns. Incorporation of transitional curves between straights and turns, including transitional banking, is very important, and this has really only been in racing in the last 20, 30 years. Don't overslope the straight to facilitate better drainage. Quite frankly, if you can keep your straight at a nil percentage, the better. Please don't go over 1%. Unfortunately, there's not much knowledge in the industry at all when it comes to banking and calculations. So therefore, most racing experts these days are either basing their calculations on canvas, either on road or railway design to determine the crossfall of turns and bends. And the next, you need to understand the turf species that you've selected and how it will work within your environment. Implementing the above should be fairly straightforward for greenfield sites, but obviously can be extremely difficult to change some of these for renovations when you consider some of these are so important factors. The designing of any new racing or training track is very much the first step in providing a safe and consistent surface. It's disappointing that many people associated with track construction related projects don't follow through in the areas that I'd now like to talk about, which I think are just in some cases more important than the design itself. I find it very hard to believe that in 2018 we're still seeing tracks that are finished that don't meet design stakeholder expectations either immediately or after several years. So what must be considered? Really what I'm trying to say is that building the track or designing the track is only one very small part of what we need to do to come up with a consistent and safe track. There's many aspects that need to be done. We all know the saying, horses for courses. What about track surface selection for climate and stakeholders' expectations? Basically, there is no one solution fits all. Just because it works in the UK does not mean it's going to work in Australia, and does not necessarily mean it's going to work in America. Look at what happened in California a couple of years ago. It was dirt out, synthetic surfaces in, back to dirt. what I believe happened there wasn't that they did a bad job with synthetics. What happened there, in my opinion, was that they were totally misaligned with stakeholders' expectations, and that it wasn't related to construction problems with synthetics. It was just that there was just a whole mismatch between stakeholders, management, government, etc. So we need to understand, again, expectation of stakeholders. I strongly recommend that clients also, or clubs, recreate the profile in a soil laboratory to understand its performance. This goes for all people selling all types of tracks, whether they're synthetics, dirt or turf tracks. I really believe you should, first of all, recreate them in a laboratory. Just don't work off what people tell you works. And sorry, I just don't believe in marketing material. We looked at 3 synthetic surfaces for Chung Fa, and we sent them. They were kind enough to give us samples. We sent them off to a lab in Victoria and tested them. I always promise I never give results out, and I'm not going to do that today, but I was quite surprised that one of the company's products actually far exceeded their brochure's expectations. So sometimes it is worth testing. You're not always looking for the negative. In this case, I actually found quite a large positive. This particular slide here, and it's probably getting a little bit busy, this slide outlines what I think a third party should be testing. And this is based on a sand-based system. And it helps you understand the shear and vertical strengths and the drainage performance that you're going to get. There's one on there, and I was talking to Brian Stewart, and he said to me he never thought about doing an acid test on gravel. He thought gravel was gravel. Believe it or not, that you've got to remember that you're using pesticides, chemicals, fertilisers. Some gravels break down quite a lot quicker than others. They're affected. So you could quite honestly go and get a gravel, put it in your profile, and suddenly find that 7 or 8 years later that your drainage is not working, and it's simply because you've got the wrong gravel. I'm not sure how many people bother to test a gravel. This type of turf assessing is also available for synthetic tracks and dirt tracks. And again, I suggest that if you're looking at something like a dirt track, do some of the correspondence out of America and seriously go to the white paper that was published on dirt tracks. There's so much information on there, which I'm not going to cover today. This slide is the exact profile that we've just finished installing at the Hong Kong Jockey Club's new training centre in Chung Fa, China. Before you try to copy this and race out and build a sand-based system based on this drawing, there's some very crucial information missing, and that's actually the sand and gravel envelopes that we use and the depths of the profile. Before we chose this and before we actually went ahead and installed it, we created this profile in a soil laboratory in Melbourne, and we actually played with quite a large range of sands and gravels, and we conducted the 12 parameter tests on each of those samples before we finally chose, and we came up with one that we believe works best for our stakeholders' expectations. It should be obvious that construction is important as design. The client should engage preferably a contractor with sports field construction knowledge. Please do not go and find a road builder, but we seem to keep doing it. Continually test materials that are being delivered to ensure they are within your allowable tolerances. Again, please don't trust suppliers and/or contractors. Do it yourself. Establish a monitoring system to ensure that all the works are undertaken in accordance with the agreed specification. To do this, you should be establishing hold points. And this particular slide is an on-site laboratory that we set up at Chung Fa. What we would do there is we would test every third or fourth load of material that came in. We've got some young staff that we recruited locally. We sent them off to training. They did all the site testing for us. And then about every one of their 15 tests that they did as a control mechanism, we would send those off to Australia for testing. As you can see, they're only young, they're very bright, so we had no problem training staff to do all the quality control work ourselves. This slide shows how we implemented hold points for the turf track construction at Chung Fa to ensure that each stage of construction met the specification before we moved on to the next. So what we're saying is before we would do anything at all, we would make sure that we were completely happy, say, with the gravel and choker production, with testing, etc., before we would move on to the next part. So we actually had 21 hold points, and any one of those points we could have stopped construction to rectify. In this particular case at Chung Fa, the overall tolerance in the construction from the hard base to the top of the turf, we had 10 millimetres for the total profile. So what I'm saying there is if the gravel layer was 10 millimetres out, the rest of it had to be zero tolerance. If you don't monitor the supply of your materials and the actual construction like this, you don't have a very high chance of achieving what I would call as a consistent, well-performing track. This obviously should be done independently, and you don't get your contractor to do it. It doesn't cost much money to do things like this. Quite frankly, it's just expertise and professionalism. The next thing we look at in track design is one of the aspects of track design that's totally overlooked in many cases by contractors, track experts, and people coming in and building tracks for you, is the expertise that you're going to need later on, the expertise in machinery for ongoing maintenance. The track expert and or the proprietary track supplier should ensure that the client has the expertise to maintain the racing or training surface and also has the correct machinery to undertake the maintenance. Unfortunately, there have been occasions where the client has not had the expertise, and in some cases the client didn't even know he required it. Your track may require a whole new type of expertise to manage it and operate it. You may have to upskill your staff, and that shouldn't be too difficult. But there's no point in spending large sums of money on building what you think is going to be a well-performed international track if you haven't got the machinery, you haven't got the expertise, and you haven't got the knowledge. In that case, what you should be doing is getting the person who you're either your track expert or your supplier to work with you and maybe stay with you for 6 months, 12 months, come back every 6 months and do the knowledge transfer that you need. It would only cost you a small percentage of your capital cost, but you'll get your money back tenfold very quickly. I've also talked to other racing groups about ongoing performance monitoring, but sadly this has not been implemented in many cases. I strongly recommend that track operators establish a strong, good measurable monitoring system to track performance and establish proactive maintenance for their tracks. Most CEOs have a whole system to track the performance of their staff. They make their staff set objectives, they have KPIs, we have so many things in management now. I personally recommend you do exactly the same thing for your racing and training surface. This busy slide is how the Hong Kong Jockey Club's tracks team monitored the performance of its tracks on a race day. This is not a huge task to record the track's performance, and we use both a scientific approach and the old-fashioned go and ask questions. This method clearly enables any track manager to monitor the performance against surface preparation and weather, and to identify any performance deterioration over time that helps you to develop proactive maintenance programs. This does not cost you any money to set up systems of this nature. Frankly, it's only about being personally professional. I would also recommend a yearly audit on racetracks performed by a third party. It easily enables a club to compare the current track's performance with previous years. In Hong Kong, we do this every April, and we've been doing it now for some 14 years. It's far too easy for track managers and people like myself to find themselves in the comfort zone and not notice year-on-year performance variations. Remember the old business example that we hear about when we go on team building exercises of the frog in the cold water that starts to heat up slowly, and before he realises anything, it's boiling. So you do need someone to come in from time to time and give you a reality check. What we do in Hong Kong is we actually lay every year's audit over the previous, so we have 12 or 14 years of results and we start to track them. So we can tell you in April this year how our track was performing to 14 years ago. The last point concerning after construction follow-up, I would like to make a recommendation that you should establish qualifiable target levels for tracks and clearly define what your minimum and maximum target factors are for individual tracks and what your critical performance areas are. Your tracks managers can easily establish this type of performance targets If not, then I'm sure there's plenty of people out there can help you. This is an example of some of the targets that we've set. I'm slightly superstitious, so I've got to be careful here. I actually established this system myself quite a few years ago, and it's based on a system that was done for AFL in Australia, Australian Football League. We did this after we had a young lady called Willie Khan clipped heels and unfortunately came down, and a horse that was at the back of the field landed on her chest and she was unfortunately killed. I had the dreadful experience of going through a coroner's court interview with the police, and they asked a very simple question: how do you know your track was safe? Now, in my mind, it was a very simple matter of clipped heels. But if you've ever tried to explain to non-racing people what a safe track are, it's very, very difficult. So I followed the AFL system of establishing what I considered was a whole list of target levels and performing levels. So we came up with things like pH levels, phosphorus, potassium, etc., things like chemicals. We looked at things like what we would accept for minimum for grass gaps. We come up with percentages. We won't accept any more than 1% of weeds in the track. We came up with root depths. We won't accept a track with less than an 80mm root depth. We came up with minimum shear vein readings. We won't accept a track that has a shear vein reading of less than 5.5%. Our track should be able to drain at 250mm per hour for saturated hydroactivity. Unsaturated 50mm an hour minimum. We prefer 150 maximum. We come up with all these types of target levels, and we do operate within them, and every race meeting we go out and we ensure that. And as I said, we just followed the AFL system. It does keep you very focused, and it also clearly sets out to anybody what the parameters of operation of your track are. In summary, there are many factors that need to be considered when designing and instructing racing and training tracks to achieve a safe and consistent surface. The track expert needs the expertise of others to achieve his design criteria, and the stakeholders expect and what he requires for the ongoing expertise to ensure that future expectations are fulfilled. So what I'm trying to remind everybody is that it's a lot more than just designing a track to have a track that's consistent and safe. It's an ongoing thing over that once you finish your track, you need the expertise, you need to understand your maintenance, you need to set goals, you need to follow up. And basically, I love my motor racing, so I like this slide. I've used this a couple of times. Basically, it's like motor racing, where you have many factors and components coming together to provide that winning formula. It does not happen by luck, but it happens by good planning, excellent materials, and great support. It's about the big picture, and it's like a car. If your driver's no good, you won't win. If your engine plays up, you won't win. If your chassis is not balanced, you can't win. If your tyres are off, you can't win. The support crew, no good support crew, you sit in the pits for 3 or 4 minutes trying to change tyres and fix things. It's all got to come together to have that winning 100% chance. So in summary, a safe and consistent track service requires many different factors. They've all got to come together. It's got to come from the design, it's got to come from the contractors, it's got to come from your construction monitoring, and it's got to come from your ongoing expertise after. If you do all of the above, then I believe you have a sustainable, safe and consistent racing track. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
John, thank you. Well, as I said, the next speaker is the Vice Chairman of the Asian Racing Federation, but he's also Presidential Counsel for International Affairs at the Japan Racing Association. Dr. Makoto Inoue's presentation is going to be specifically about the JRA's efforts to minimize horse injuries in training and racing.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to thank the ARA Organizing Committee for giving me this opportunity to speak. Today, I'd like to talk about our effort to minimize horse injury, namely how and what JRA is committed to minimizing horse injury in training and racing. Horse racing has been developed with the aim of improvement of race horses, and we horsemen are always exploring for speed and better breed. Meanwhile, it is a fact that the more we push the horses, the more likely it could be for some horses to exceed their maximum capacity. As a result, some of them suffer injuries. In the 1970s, GRA introduced a system of keeping a total of 4,000 horses stable in 2 training centers. This made it possible to record injuries and analyze the trend. Through the analysis, we realized an increase year by year in the number of fractures in training and racing in the 1980s. From this background, GRA established Injury Task Force in 1983 to ensure athletic career of race horses, which is essential for the development of horse racing. This task force is to deal with fatal or non-fatal musculoskeletal injuries such as fractures, joint luxation, and tendon or ligament injuries. This task force is also comprised of 3 technical working groups: equine, facilities, and trainer-jockey relations. These working groups analyze the cause of accidents and study necessary measures to prevent such accidents. This slide summarizes key roles of the Injury Task Force. This task force is in charge of recording injuries, study of injury prevention, education for trainers and stable staff, and research and development of track management. This task force also sends delegates to international conferences to collect latest information and exchange ideas with representatives from other racing authorities. I wish I had enough time to explain every achievement by the Injury Task Force, but today I'd like to focus on the 4 topics shown in the slide. Number 1, a brief summary of injury statistics and analysis in JRA. Number 2, facility improvement. Number 3, system and rules revision. Number 4, our approach to jockey's safety. Now, I'd like to start with the injury statistics and analysis in JRA. This graph shows yearly statistics of fractures in racing and training. The yellow bars are in the number of fractures in racing, and the blue bars are in the number in trainings. We define a fracture as a prognosis over 3 months for recovery or requiring euthanasia, as a prognosis, which means the prognosis less than 3 months for recovery is not included. We have started keeping a record of injury since 1977 and accumulated the data for the length of time. This graph shows fracture rates in racing and training. The yellow line is the number of fractures per 1,000 starts in racing. The blue line is the number of fractures per 1,000 horses in training. The data has been collected since 1981. These data enable us a case study by race course, track surface, and track condition. The second topic is improvement of facilities and its outcome. The slide shows the fracture rates in racing along with the track reconstruction. There are 10 race courses in JRA, and all of them has a turf and a dirt track. we standardized the thickness of covering sand in that track to 7 to 8 centimeters in 1991 and 9 centimeters in 2009 in order to secure a cushioning effect. We also widened the track and installed what we call spiral corner, where the radius is larger getting into the turn and becoming tighter going out. Now, please take a look at the yellow line in the slide. As the red arrows show, fracture rate was successfully reduced from 1990 to 2000, but it has been rising again after 2001. We need to look into this a bit more. This slide shows the transition of fracture rate in yellow and fatal injury rate in red since 2001. Fatal injuries include death, euthanasia, and loss of athletic ability. Although fractures have been on marginal rise, fatal injuries have been reduced in recent years. The rise in fractures may be attributed to the increase of minor injuries, of which prognoses are about 3 to 6 months for recovery. When we look at the bright side, it can be safely said that such minor injuries are now easy to find due to growing awareness injury prevention among stable staff and improvement on diagnostic capability. Also, financial compensation for injuries may play a key role, which I will talk about later. The fact that the fatal injuries are declining is very encouraging. The next slide shows the average of the turf track hardness in all of our race courses. In the 1980s, we received criticism of the turf track hardness from our jockeys. This was the same time when we started the Japan Cup, and we faced the same criticism from overseas jockeys. The facilities working group of the injury task force reviewed the drainage system of the turf track. In particular, they changed the type of sand under the turf track base to make an effective drainage possible. As a result, the hardness of turf track was dramatically reduced. We have also introduced a track maintenance machine with soil shattering function and another one called batch drain, which is equipped with a number of tines to penetrate the soil. The picture on the upper right is a turf track base after the use of these machines. This may look a bit painful, but enable the base to aerate and absorb more nutrients, allowing healthy growth to turf with great cushioning. If possible, I would like to use a batch drain and soil shattering machine with my head. Better late than never, but too late. The next slide shows the timing of introduction of new facilities in the training center, and the possible effect on fractures occurrence in training. The fracture rate in training started reducing from 1993 and steady after 2001. We have placed the uphill track in 1985, swimming pool in 88, wood chip track in 99, and a new pole track in 2008. Trainers and jockeys are now well acquainted with the characteristics of each training tracks and choose the track depending on physical condition of each horse. I assume this may be one of the reasons for the decrease in fracture in training. Next item is introduction of system and rules revision. Until 1960, there was no limit to the number of runners per race. In terms of safety for horse and jockey, we gradually reduced the maximum number of runners. In 1987, the injury task force compiled the analysis indicating that the more runner in a race, the higher the incident rate rises. This built up the momentum for the change even further. Since 1992, we have kept 18 as the limit for the number of runners in all the races. I would also like to briefly touch on our recent study with regard to the change of medication rules and its possible impact on the injury occurrence. GRA presented our study results at the International Conference of Racing Analysts and Veterinarians held in Dubai last March. In 2010, the GRA has tightened the regulation to restrict the use of corticosteroid. We compare the injury occurrence before and after this revision and found a significant decrease in the rates for certain musculoskeletal injuries, including fatal injuries, tendon or ligament rupture, and fetlock fractures. In summary, the restriction on the anti-inflammatory medication may be effective for injury prevention. The next slide explains the financial support system for owners in JRA. In 1955, JRA has started providing a financial compensation for horse injuries. This was established to reduce the financial burden of owners by the unforeseen accident to his or her racehorse, and also ensure a proper period of rest for the racehorse. At the racing operation, we can easily detect the horses that are not in good physical condition for racing. We also encourage and subsidize the use of aluminum alloy horseshoes. In the past, Japanese horses were wearing iron shoes in training and aluminum shoes in racing only. With this subsidy, the use of aluminum alloy shoes has become very common in racing and training. We have conducted the survey for 7 years after the introduction of subsidy program and found that a racehorse with aluminum alloy shoes carried lower rates of injuries. Last item is our approach to ensure jockey's safety in relation to horse injury. Several years ago, a jockey suffered serious injuries by crushing the rail post in racing. This unhappy accident forced us to research for new materials for the rail post. We ran material tests over and over to specify the best material in terms of the flexibility, fragility, and utility, and finally found out that FRP5 would be the best, and this is installed in all of our race courses. With this approach, we are successful with minimizing the impact on the jockeys colliding with the rail. Now, I'd like to summarize my presentation. We have established the injury task force and conducted a variety of researches. The training center administered by ourselves is a great advantage to ensure a good environment for data collection and communication with stable staff. Also, our own equine research center can analyze various data to advise us what measures to take. Based on our researches and studies, we have carried out facility improvement and rule revision to achieve injury prevention and ensure sound horse welfare. In concluding, my suggestions are as follows. Good communication between trainers, jockeys, track engineers, and vets is very important. Injury statistics must be recorded for analysis. Facility improvement and revision of system and rule help to reduce injury. Medication control has a good influence on injury occurrence. I believe that we need to continue our effort to ensure safer horse racing for horses. And I'm happy to share with you our knowledge and experience to minimize horse injuries. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Inoue-san. Our next speaker has been in charge of the preparation and maintenance of sports arenas for over 30 years. So what he doesn't know probably isn't worth knowing. Graeme Logan is now the grounds manager at one of the world's very, very top stadiums. It is the Sydney ANZ Stadium. I think we're very lucky to have Graeme here. Graeme?
Thank you. Thank you. That makes me sound very old. Just like to thank the association, the organisation of the 37th ARC for the opportunity to present. So my spin on today will be just to give all the people associated have been here for the last 5 days enjoying what's believed to be a great conference. Bit of a different view or a different spin into the world of turf and what we're able to do with it and what it tolerates and what it doesn't. And I'm sure you guys won't believe that some of the things that we've subjected ourselves to but still come out doing what we do. So we'll just proceed. If we can get it moving. That's our event schedule. I think you guys talk about racing days, etc. I think there's 57, 58 events on the calendar. As you can see, there's no real downtime in the sports entertainment business. And like you guys, it's not just racing anymore. It's not just football. It's not soccer. It's called the events industry, events and entertainment, and that's what we provide. And we're all part of it in some way. So just highlighting a couple of fixtures there. I don't know how visible it is back there. But in February, March, we have a lot of concerts. We have a lot of multi things on our turf or on our venue that aren't directly related to sport. And the challenge for us is with that is the turnaround time to bring it out of a, say, a concert mode or something similar event into a sporting fixture. So we get given time frames of 11 days. We had Ed Sheeran out there. I don't know if many people are familiar with Ed Sheeran. We had 3 concerts of his, which means the ground was out of action and covered for 7 days. We had 5 days to turn that around with a turf replacement of 3,200 square metres and played on 4 days later for a triple header of rugby league. And all that comes in, being a long time in the industry, is preparation and planning. We're never in the business to say no, it can't happen, it can't be done. All management wants to know, and we've spoke at length to various people in the last day or two about this, is a can-do attitude, and it can happen if you put the proper preparation and planning into it. So they're the challenges for us. So we're just going to take you through some things which challenge us in our profession. That's ultimately our goal. We try and get to that. So that's what they want to see 3 to 4 or 5 days, if we're lucky, after a major concert, monster trucks, etc., etc. Some of the things when I was putting this presentation together is a bit of a flashback of, in hindsight, all the terrible things that we've done to the ground, but also a great thing. It's brought a lot of industry, a lot of business, and a lot of money through the gates. So that's a typical major presentation for, say, a major rugby union, rugby league grand final, state of origin. That's our goal. Here are some of the things we face, some of the obstacles we overcome, and I'm not sure if this will show up. Yeah, we have depends which one I pick, is the logos, the application of logo paint. Now, going back 10, 12 years ago, the paints that they used to put all the logos down, and they now use them in racing, I believe, everywhere, used to stay in the grass, kill the grass, and we used to replace our logo area 3 to 4 times a year. But we work with the guys who manufacture the paints, and they're all sort of organic paints now, which everything we do at the stadium needs to be like a jigsaw puzzle. It needs to be able to be dismantled, come off and rub off overnight. These logos will go down on the morning of a game. When you're looking at a major game like a State of Origin, you'll have 2,500 square metres of paint that'll go down for field colouring on that day. I'm not sure if it makes a lot of sense. But the ability, then we just wash it out that night with a specially designed dishwashing liquid, which is designed. The paint we use actually has malt in it, the same malt they brew beer with. We chose malt because it's friendly to the turf. It's a sugar-based product, and it helps the plant. It helps keep the paint soft and pliable. So moving forward. There we go, a few more issues we deal with, not just the logo areas, but the quite brown tinge to that is pyrotechnics, fireworks burns. And that happens to us a few times a year as well. There are other issues we try and deal with. Then we get into the preparation for every event we have at the stadium seems to draw the major event status, so everyone wants to feel compelled to put a stage out there, rehearse on it, etc. Anywhere up to 30, 40 dancers, 50, 500, 2,000. Depending on what sort of program they're putting together. And they just want to display vehicles for some reason, just part of the deal with a major sponsorship, and everyone putting their brand on it. Rehearsals for those can be up to 12, 18, 22 vehicles. And what you're seeing here is out from a major event is 3 to 4 days of regular rehearsals and practice routines, so they can all script it to match television timings, broadcasting. Another thing they've taken, I was thinking today this would be a great one for the racing industry. Anyone thought about letting fans on the track afterwards? No? I don't know why not. The only one who complain would be the track manager. So they're letting this is to give the fans, this is another thing that to bring the people through the gate is there's a lot of passionate sporting people out there, a lot of passionate followers. Just want to go out and touch the hallowed turf after their beloved teams have played on it. So that's just another thing that we do, another challenge. That's what they can leave you with after a major event. Nice, green and lush. It'd be quite easy just to lose your passion for it, but that's our challenge, is the clean-up and recovery after we've been subjected to the types of events we are. There we go. That's if anyone's familiar with NRL, that's our grand final. That's our massive day of the year where we have a packed stadium of 83,500 people. Within 4 hours of the game being over, that's what you're left to contend with. And these are some of the challenges, some of the huge time frames we've had to fit a lot of work in. So there we have the logos, still remnant, the stains of the grass, the rubbish blowing over the whole stadium. 4 hours later, this is still dark, mind you. This is about 8 hours after the actual game's finished. We're rolling in for our next event. It's a multi-use stadium, and that's what we're doing. So the guys are laying out a ground protection product to enable this to put a foreign substance on top of the sand-based fill that we have, so we don't get any contamination. In the course of that, this is 5 a.m. the morning after a grand final. We had some drainage issues in the middle of the field. We had a concrete slab they put originally in there to hold turf drop-in wickets. The field wasn't draining, so that was our window of opportunity to pull out and upgrade the drainage in the middle of the field. Now, not saying that this whole presentation doesn't have anything to do with horse racing, because we actually have a little bit to do with the horses. So we were given an 8-week window to originally pull the middle of the field out, take the slab out, redo the drainage and put it back in. That window got closed down to 3 weeks. And this is the preparation for the event we had coming up, which is geofabric, 10,000 sheet supply, and 3,800 tonnes of a crushed red roof tile for dirt to fabricate this event. So this is all happening in the week after our allegedly feed up time with our major sport finish, and then a roller coaster right through summer, but it just doesn't happen in our industry anymore. All to produce this, the middle's gone. The guys are building a track, and you'll see what it's for in a moment. So they're putting down, and I know mentioned the previous speakers doing a lot of testing on types of surfaces, surface hardness. This was actually testing for a production we had coming called Ben-Hur, which involved horses running in the middle of the stadium, but they needed a hard red clay-based soil, similar to what they make loam tennis courts out of. So this is about day 5 now. This is happening. Then they start to fill in the middle. Production rolls in for our next event to completely cover the field again with geofabric, plywood and soil. That was the finished product. They needed us to build a coliseum. Now, they originally gave us 8 weeks because this was going to be a practice venue that they built somewhere else. But at the last minute, the practice venue was unavailable, so we had to build that within the confines of the main stadium. So if you can see the relevance of that, and it's quite funny when you're looking at it a week and a half before that, you're actually playing rugby league. That's what we produced on the night. That was all for this. We had 2.5 weeks of these guys rehearsing with horses, teams of horses. And look, obviously everyone here knows something or a bit or a lot about horses, but they'd been putting this show together, and the guys dealing with the horses for 2 years. They went through 2,500 horses to find 8 teams of 4 on the selection. Horses just didn't like each other, the colour compatibility, the quietness of the whole thing. So it was quite an interesting event to see outside your normal sporting fixture. But we do, in essence, we do 2 to 3, maybe 4 varied events similar to this each season on top of our regular sporting challenges. There we go. That's the aftermath. Everything's over. Now it's the clean up and try and get it back to the stage of the next event. The next event getting ready for is monster trucks. There again, the grass gets exposed for 4 or 5 days, a little bit of light on it, depending on what we've got. To build any monster truck fans in the audience, it's quite a challenge event, quite taxing on the ground, especially. And the good thing is, it comes at the time of the year when we come into favourable grass recovery and growing times, being 2 weeks after a major grand final in October. Just to produce the spectators, and there again, it's another 55,000, 60,000 patron event for the stadium. So they've had it now for about 6 years in a row because it's a winner. And there again, it's another avenue of revenue for the stadium. It's thinking outside the square. Ultimately, concerts are our biggest challenge. We call it metal death track. Just for everyone in the industry, if a lot of people, and I'm not sure if there's any here, say they have suppliers of turf protection, none of them protect turf. They nearly enable them to build things on turf. There's not a lot of products out there that will do that. And this will, it's probably a little bit dark, but the whole base of that stage, which was 4,800 square metres, was metal aluminium track, which allows you to drive forklift cranes, etc., 125-tonne cranes, etc. And I heard someone complaining earlier about 600-kilo horses running on the turf. That's to the night of the show, and then your thinking caps on, and your production planning is about how you're going to recover, how you're going to come out of those events. This was a stage for you too, by the way. One of our biggest events there was Andre Rieu. The ground was covered for 22 days. And all we lost out of that was 3,400 square metres of turf. And that's through doing what we do, protecting the turf and getting it into a state where it can handle such a covering and minimising the replacement afterwards to roll into our next event. Any Andre Rieu fans here? Never heard of him. frozen. It's moving, but not on the screen. No, it isn't. So there we go. That was Adele. That was another massive stage. Adele was a sellout of 85,000 people, 3 concerts in a row. And that's our ultimate goal. This is a little bit slow, actually. And that's what we present. It's come up quite dark on the thing, but this is actually our target of what we present, literally anywhere from 5 to 7 to 12 days after a concert. That's our challenge. This is our turf replacement. So after those major events, depending on the wear and tear and where it is, we're able to harvest, roll out, replace turf and play on it literally the same day. So it's lay and play. There's a couple of types of varieties of turf we use in systems. There's 2 to 3 out there that work quite well for us. They're a natural turf with a synthetic reinforcement, so it still presents to be a natural turf, but it has synthetic assistance in it. We're able to put the rolls of turf down, which are 1 metre wide, 10 metres long, and each roll weighs a tonne. So there's no physically way of them moving once they're laid in the ground. And they're usually 45 to 50 mil, which is 1 3/4 to 2 inches in thickness. That's another thing we use to help recover, grow lights and shade cloth. It's a growth mat. It's actually, it's permeable. It'll let light, moisture and products through. If you want to spray over the top of it or irrigate, it'll actually let all that through, as well as letting the light through. We don't put a totally covered seal plastic because that would actually cook it. And there are our grow lights, which are used quite big in Europe in a lot of areas. The MCG have 15 units. I think Etihad Stadium has 13. We operate with 6 because we've got a little bit better climate as far as producing turf. There we go, a mill out. This will be the week before State of Origin, which is normally a target to get to the middle of the year without it doing turf replacement, and it just wears out from the sheer volume of fixtures. You're looking at an area of about 3,500 square metres. That takes about 1.5 days to mill out prep and about 2 days. So over 4 days we can mill out, replace that turf and have it ready playable in a state fit to go in 4 days. That's what we're left with, the look of that after some of the concerts, etc., all the various things we have there. It could be a little disheartening if you're not used to seeing that or not prepared or expected what's coming. And the challenge for us is preparing the surface, getting it ready to take the concert or whatever they're throwing at, and having an option to be able to bring it back into play as soon as we can, because we never shut for 8 to 9 weeks. That's just not our... That's the type of, just want to demonstrate the type of mill-out machine. I'm not sure whether a lot of people have seen that. It's a Coro top maker. You can adjust it down to whatever the depth the turf replacement profile's coming in at, and you literally can lay and play straight behind that machine. It does a great job. So it doesn't always look green and rosy for us. There's a lot of challenges with what we do. And that's another example of how, if anyone can see that, it strips out the turf to a level which is absolutely perfect. It's got some great machine technology there. There we go. That's a version of the roller turf that we roll out there. Not quite sure if they've used, I think they may have used a similar product for turf racing for some of the track crossovers, etc. You can grow that to any length to what suits, but our preference is nothing. It needs to be deeper than 40 mil, 1 3/4. That suffices for the traffic we can play on it. And we place scrums, all that type of thing on it. It doesn't move. So it's tried and tested technology. Does rain a little bit. You can guarantee that it's always going to rain on a major event. That was the morning of a State of Origin game. And we've got excellent drainage there. That disappeared about 30 minutes after it stopped raining. I think we had 115 mils the night before and the morning of, and came through and played the game okay. There we go. This is another shot of our aids we use to help us grow and get the surface back in state. And I can probably try and wrap this up a little bit. That's just a night shot of our grow lights. Now, just everyone calls them heat lamps. They're not heat lamps. They're actually just enable our growing light of turf to have longer hours. So they don't exactly draw a lot of it. With the covers out and the heat and the grow lights on, you might increase the ground temperature of 1 to 2 degrees, but they're there for the sheer factor of giving you longer growing light hours in our daylight. Without getting too technical, that's the most critical thing to growing turf, is actual sunlight, which I believe is a big challenge in a lot of the Asian countries. There we go. That's a night shot of the stadium. So I think I've done well, sort of cutting it up. Just a few facts. It's an 83,500 seat stadium. We host over 50 national events, and that doesn't include your training days and your week-to-week conference, etc., which we have on the arena as well. Turnstiles you can pump through it. Good thing about all the modern venues now is the ability to get people in and out of there quicker, the ability to pour a lot of beer in a lot of hurry, feed a lot of people, etc. And a couple of interesting facts there on our food and beverage side of things, which is all part of the whole stadium, what we do. And just the things turf-wise, we replace approximately 10 to 15,000 square metres of turf annually, depending on the concerts and variety of different events we have. We have 4 800,000 litre irrigation tanks. We use roughly, just for line marking out the actual lines, we go through about 1,200 litres of line marking paint. We average, because we collect our clippings, and whether we want to get too technical with that, per week, because we don't leave our grass on top. It works out about 3.5 tonnes of grass that we pull off a football field a week on an annual basis. And we oversee using about 7 tonnes of ryegrass through our winter season. So that was just some stats. So I think I've done, wrapped it up. All good. And just a closing note, that is, and we spoke about this, I think we're going to speak about this now, is the diversity that you've got to show when you're in our industry now. All right, thank you.
Fascinating, Graeme. Thank you very much indeed. I'm happy to say we've got about 20 minutes to get some more thoughts. And Dr. Kenichi has joined us to translate for Inoue-san, who would prefer to speak in Japanese. But Graeme, let's start with you. I mean, 30 years experience, more across a range of sports. And just forgive me, clarify something for me personally, because I'm watching at an extreme angle and the speakers are all pointing out towards the audience. The picture you showed of the Ben-Hur event was on dirt. Was that the only racing that you have at ANZ? Or you...
Motorbike racing, we've had speedway.
But in terms of horses?
Yes, in terms of horses, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. I mean, how does all of your experience across a multitude of sports, how does it affect what you do in racing? How do you learn from one to apply it to racing, given that the horse is a live animal and all the other things like cars and speedway, motorbikes and stuff? Yeah. How does that affect what you do with horses?
Oh, look, we've touched on horse racing, horse tracks, various types of tracks. Bone of contention is with a lot of people is height of cut. What height do they cut tracks at? We've looked at a lot of racing tracks. Depends on the turf species. A lot of tracks are Kikuyu in Australia and Cooch. Kikuyu requires to be cut a little bit different height than the Cooch. It really depends on a lot of things. Your soil type, but my theory is the higher the grass, the less grass quality you have. Because when you get over 4 inches, 5 inches, 6 inches, you're producing upright growth of turf. Basic rule of thumb with turf, close mowing promotes lateral growth and recovery of turf. A lot of guys may cut their track once a week, etc. But when you're getting 5, 6, 7 inches, the grass actually starts to roll back over on top of itself. You'll find that your divot repair and recovery doesn't happen as frequent. And a lot of the thinking in the old school thinking is it's for the softness and the cushion of the horse. Just explain to me that race horses are a lot lighter than polo horses, correct? Polo fields play on, and are we inches or are we metric, or polo fields are 25 to 30 mil, inch and a half.
Yeah, I think we're metric, yeah.
Yep. Race horses run in a straight line. Someone alluded to me, they run a lot faster, but they're a lot lighter. So that theory that it produces a soft, moisture controls your hardness of your soil profile as well as your soil type. So getting and we've looked at a lot of this, and we test everything because everyone's looking for an advantage, whether it's in our industry or another industry associated with us. How do we get in front of the opposition? So there's a lot of relative factors we do there, is how to grow grass under stress and how to get recovery. So longer, taller turf takes a lot longer to recover, believe it or not, because a lot of energy in the turf plant, without getting too technical, is wasted in pushing upright growth as opposed to a lateral growth, which you need to improve divots, etc. And you'll get no better root structure out of letting grass go 5, 10 inches than you will out of something, say, around the 3 to 4 inches.
listen, both of you should feel free to pick up on any points that are being discussed if you have something to say about that.
Well, from our perspective, we cut at the old measurement of 3 inches or 75 millimetres. I know a lot of race clubs cut longer than that. If we have to, we'll cut twice a week, no problem at all. I agree totally with Graeme. It's, for us, the most important thing that we look on a race day is moisture content. That determines everything for us. We try to race at about 23% moisture by volume. We're so paranoid on that every morning when we race, we go and we take samples out of the ground, we weigh them, we then bake them in an oven, then we re-weigh them again. That's the level of detail that we're looking at to try to get as close as we possibly can to the measurement of moisture that we're looking for.
You mentioned in your presentation, John, that material has been published about track hardness, but as far as you're concerned, it's not translated currently into design factors for construction. But then we did have Dr. Inoue talk about how the hardness of the tracks that the JRA is responsible for has changed. But I want to just go back to that point yesterday about Dr. Chris Whitton's presentation, in which he said it really struck me, remember I come from outside the industry, that on the fetlock joint of a horse, at a general gallop, not even its fastest gallop, it's putting 4 tons of weight on that joint with every stride. So do you feel that because of the importance of the hardness of a track, there needs to be a lot more research done on this and action taken?
I totally agree. I was at a veterinary conference a couple of weeks ago where there was a lot of information coming out. But for someone like myself, and I've had the privilege of talking to some very well-known world vets from around the world. I was actually at the World Vet Congress. And where we struggle is we all have our own opinion on what hardness is. I've got my own opinion. And to be fair, what you would expect to produce a track in England, produce one in Hong Kong and produce one in Australia are entirely different. And if you went and took what they call what they rated a track good in England and dropped that in Sydney, I think the local stakeholders would just about take your head off because they're not used to racing on surfaces like that, etc. But what we don't understand is what is the optimum hardness for a horse. And I think we've all got our own opinion, and we're very clear on what we think our opinion is. Ours is about 2.7 on the penetrometer, the way we do it. On the dirt track, my personal preference on the dirt track using a Clegg hammer is 10.2, and I'm quite adamant on that. But I really can't translate that back to what a vet would be giving me from the information. And I think what we need to do is for the vets and ourselves to come together and try to take the 2 pieces of data and come up with a common formula. That's what's missing.
Dr. Inoue, give us a general overview, if you would, about the most critical factors in maintaining safety, both at the race course but also at training centres.
施設馬場につきましては、毎日同じ状況を保つことが重要だと思います。同じ状況。厩舎関係者と当然で毎日のように意見交換を図ってですね、何か変化していることがないか確認しているようにしております。また関係者とのコミュニケーションが非常に重要になっているだろうと思います。
Okay, the goal of the safety of the facilities is how well you can maintain the same good condition every day. So we try to communicate with the racing connections, such as trainers, jockeys, grooms, at the training centers almost every day, and try to pick up any minor problems that we hear. We will try to solve it an instant. So a communication between those racing connections are very important factors.
I'll come back to this issue of safety and look to the future for a moment. But actually, Graeme, it occurs to me that because you've worked in so many different sports and you also understand about racing, what do you see from outside the racing industry as being challenges that are specific to it when it comes to safety of venues?
Look, from the turf practitioner side, I think they're, and we do it in most sports, and I believe they've gone to AFL for how they test ground, because there's nothing said on how you test. Everything's about liability. That's what usually starts the process, is who's responsible when bad injuries heaven forbid, happen, and it's no different in our sports. But it's the education of the turf practitioners now. There needs to be a lot more training, and those guys need to be responsible and be involved in part of the whole. We're very, really lucky where we are at the stadium, where we're one of 130 permanent people that work on the venue, and your part and your role is just as important as any other member there. But it's user education. It's the turf practitioner really knowing about turf, not just about the horse racing, but about what his role is, and communication. And those guys should never give up trying to learn, trying to look for an edge on how to make their product. And if they're getting very poor results, the thing that's infuriating for me is, and look, you get anywhere where there's media attached to you, you're exposed to speculation and innuendo. It's when the guys repeatedly don't respond or do nothing about that's frustrating from a point of view.
If I can just come in
Yes.
there, talking about preparation of tracks, one thing that I think people in my field should never lose sight of, and I know people who prepare arenas like Graeme are very focused on this. When a football player turns up, he's concerned about his own personal injury, so he expects a field that is the same every time, that's going to give him the same support. And this is one thing that we strive for in Hong Kong, and I think other countries should as well, is it doesn't really matter what the weather conditions are, that the trainer, the jockey, and our racing fans know precisely what they're going to get for the footing. And it shouldn't change that much with weather conditions. So it needs to be very, very reliable. And, in Hong Kong racing, where our pools are enormous, I mean, we did 200 million last night Australian in betting turnover. It doesn't matter if you can't turn out the consistent track rating every week like they do in sports arenas, and they do it incredibly well. And I think we in racing can learn so much from sports. If you don't turn that out, then your income starts to go up and down. So people just rely on it. And we work very, very hard, and that's why we do so many measurements. We're just looking for consistency, the same in, week out, regardless of weather conditions.
Yes, and I presume, Dr. Inoue, that means looking not only at the now, but looking at the future as well to see what developments are coming, what innovations are coming that can all help towards improving safety standards. Do you see anything on the horizon, Dr. Inoue, that's going to make a significant contribution to this?
完全性あるとしましたら、馬場の管理は芝の生育状態とか排水性については、調査研究を継続して行うこと、またその結果を実際の維持管理に反映させていくことが重要だと思います。常にいつも一定が一番大事かなと思います。
I think that the research can also assist, especially focusing on growing state of the turf or the drainage, and to reflect those outcomes on the daily maintenance is important.
Graeme, John, what about you in terms of your particular fields? Have you seen anything recently? Have people come to you and said, look, we're working on this thing, and you've thought, yeah, I could be interested in that?
We're actually quite... In racing, there's not a lot of new things coming, and I use growth lights at Happy Valley. I think we're the only racetrack in the world that actually use growth lights. We have a problem there with the buildings are always in shade. We have a lot of problem with sunlight hours. So we've used growth lights. They have made quite a large difference to Happy Valley. I think the track's a lot better, especially in the straight where we were lacking with sun. I think one thing you can look at is what's happening in other areas like bowling greens, golf. There's a lot of new equipment coming into golf that I believe can be adapted for racing. So make sure that you just don't live in your own little bubble. And I think the other thing that we can start to see a lot of improvement is I think we need to find smarter young staff who see turf as a career, not so much racing but turf, who want to learn, who want to go out and happy to do their courses out of America, want to learn on lab work. I think there's a lot we can do by education of our staff and looking at what other people are doing. And I think sometimes we look too much in the box and not enough out of it.
Graeme?
Yeah, I agree with John. Like in our industry, which is relevant, it's not just pigeonholed as sports turf. As I said, we're all in the events industry. We are always working on huge products. We're testing at the moment. We do monthly of new products we can lay over turf to be able to hold functions, similar to some of the events we've had, pull it off and conduct play that night. So they've got to be weight bearing, they've got to be light transparent, they've got to tick a lot of boxes. Also the types of machinery, just talking to a few of the race people, some here and some in the last few years, there's a lot of negativity about where they're at. They seem to think that what they've got is what there is now, but people who said, I don't know, I've lost count of how many people have told me in the last 2 or 3 years you can't grow grass in sand, you can't aerate your tracks because it'll soften it for the horses and they won't like it. There's a lot of old faux pas that are still there that I guess need to be buried and a bit more lateral thinking encouraged. But there are a lot of things happening out there. We're working on products which will incubate grass and produce 5 to 7 millimetres of growth and regrow overnight through oxygen tents, etc. How you implement that on a major race surface, but the technology is out there to produce more events on the turf, on any turf, is revenue at the end of the day. Thinking outside the square, and I believe a lot of the tracks are doing it now, building many infrastructures in the inside track, motels, etc., small mini putt-putt golf, other avenues to bring punters and people through the gates.
Sure.
One of the things that we face in racing is that Sha Tin Racecourse is 11 times the size of ANZ Stadium, which creates its own problems. But I've been to many conferences where people tell me once you put a verti-drain through a track, you can't put a horse over it for 3 weeks. We'll put a horse over a verti-drain track 3 days later. I've had people tell me you can't core a track and race on it. We'll core on a Monday and race on a Sunday. Actually, people, what you need to learn is the more you work a track, the more you do it. Actually, the easier it is, the better it copes. And one of the problems I see in racing is that they tend to let the track get so hard that when they go in and aerate it and do work on it, they just make such a massive change that then trainers and owners come back and say, what have you done to the track? It's so different. So I think what racing needs to do is work it as often as you possibly can so that the variations in what you're producing are absolutely minor. And as an example of that, when we put the American dirt track in, we were told by the company that installed it we should do our lab work every quarter and adjust our levels of silt and clays, etc., every quarter. We did that for a while, and John Size, who I have great respect for, came into my office one day and said, John, you put silt and clay on that track last week, it's awful, because the variance was too much. So now we go and do it monthly, and I think we're about the only people in the world that do it monthly, and now you can't tell the difference. So by just doing things often and less makes such a massive difference. And these are the things we can learn from stadiums.
It's occurred to me that before we came on stage, I said to you there was something very specific I wanted to ask you. Because yesterday, Dr. Whitten was telling us that a significant number of injuries to horses happen at the starting gates. And here we are talking about racetrack management and safety, and we haven't yet mentioned it. So what do you know about the issue that horses have with starting gates? Is it the horse or the way the jockey starts the horse? What's going on?
Look, it's always everything. There's, when you have a problem, it's never one thing. It's always 3 or 4 things come together. Track managers are paranoid about the weight of starting gates. So, you know, the more padding you put on, the more safety features you put on, the heavier they get. And I know a lot of clubs are very concerned about the weight of gates. Again, the racing industry, unfortunately, there's not much R&D done. We work with one particular starting gate manufacturer out of Australia, and people can guess who that is. And we had a discussion. We wanted to change the back gates, the way they operate. We believed that the back gates could be safer than what they were manufacturing. Unfortunately, there was quite a lot of R&D involved. So in the end, the Hong Kong Jockey Club paid for most of the R&D. I believe we got a far better and far safer gate. Our statistics show us that the number of scratchings of horses at the gates went down, was reduced. So given the size of our betting pools, we probably got our money back in one scratching from the R&D. They're the things that we're not seeing happening in racing. And I think there are big improvements that can be made in that. I know at the moment they're looking at changing the padding and going into different types of padding. And I think this is where the industry needs to work a lot closer with manufacturers of equipment, and that's something the industry's not doing. I'd like to see racing get a lot more involved in R&D.
Okay, just about 2.5 minutes. Dr. Inoue, can I end with a question to you? Because we've talked about the safety of the venues in terms of the jockeys and the horses, but we haven't addressed the safety of spectators. That's surely something, when I'm watching racing on TV, I'm seeing spectators right there on the rails, and I'm thinking, hold on, if a horse comes through there, there's going to be trouble. I mean, thankfully, I've never seen it, of course, but as a spectator, if I were to go to a venue, I'd want to know that I'm going to be safe. In terms of the way the JRA designs courses, how much does it take that into account?
はい、まず2点で、一つはですね、競馬場の特性とか構造によるところもありますけれども、特定 G1 グレードレースの時にはですね、競馬場や場外馬券場は地元警察とか地元競技、事前競技を行ってですね、開催当日に事故が発生することないように、事前に危険な施設箇所がないか、警備員を増強する必要がないかなどを確認を行って安全の準備を行っているのがまず1点です。
Okay, to maintain the safety of the spectators might be depending on the construction side of the racetracks, but at the most of our racetracks, at 1 month before, like before the big races like Derby, we do a preparation consultation with the local police to reduce the risk of unexpected accidents on the race day.
あともう1点はですね、馬場と観客のところの柵とかそういうのがあるんですけども、それがあまり近いところにがあるところがあるんですけども、以前馬が拉致を飛び越えて観客の方に入ったこともありました。もうそういう危険をなくすようなために各拉致のところに人を配置してですね、その観客の安全性を守るようなこともしています。
Another point is that it was rare, but once a horse has jumped into the crowd, so from those kind of experience, we tried to post a lot of security guards to prevent those kind of unnecessary accidents. So, like in example of the Tokyo racecourse on a Derby day, attendance will be more than 120,000. So the safety of the spectators cannot be forgotten. So this will be something more that we should think in additional to the racetrack surface.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the conclusion of 3 marvelous days. I'll give you a chance to applaud in a moment because I just wanted to summarize some of what I believe probably were the main issues to come out of these 3 days. We started with Winfried Engelbrecht-Brezges, the chairman of the Asian Racing Federation, telling us how he believed that the sport should be heading towards the leisure and entertainment market. And that was when Bernard Salt told us that this century is shaping up to be the Asian century because of the changes in demographics and consumer habits, that would be a perfect opportunity for racing to take advantage of. And then we had, of course, the issue of increasing diversity in the sport. We had 4 women speak to us about various projects that are going on to encourage that. What struck me as well was, in fact, it was your panel, both of you gentlemen who were joined by 2 colleagues, was how your sport uses science and medicine to be the very best it can in terms of taking care of both the jockeys and the horses. And that stat, about 4 tons on the fetlock joint of a horse, will stay with me forever. When I'm on air and I get a chance to use that, I will definitely use that fact. And then there was your contribution yesterday as well, of course. The other one thing that will stick with me, just because I'm an outsider, that Secretariat's heart was 3 times heavier than the heart of a normal horse. Absolutely incredible. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we can thank the final panel for a final time. Thank you very much indeed. So, thank you very much for attending. Dinner is at 7 o'clock, and tonight the dinner is in the Grand Ballroom of the Intercontinental Parnas. Please bring your badges. And there, at that dinner, the hosts of the 2020 Asian Racing Conference will be announced. So, I hope to see you there. Thank you very much indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, could I just do one thing now that Adnan has said his last words, which is to thank Adnan. Please join me in thanking him. I think you will agree that he has been an adornment to the 37th ARC.